it distracts me. I don't know if it distracts you, but once I have that on, I'm like, hey, what else do I not know out in the world? But we're behind by a little bit, so I want to start right in with categorical propositions. Chapter 5. So this is the next test we're preparing for. And this one, remember I said there's actual real right and wrong answers. So that's kind of unusual today, I suppose. Right and wrong answers. So chapter 5, there's even a page number. Is it 184, I guess? I've already talked a little bit about this because these are really so important. And these go back to Aristotle. So Aristotle developed this in response to Plato. Plato thought that ideas were true. And ideas, are like goodness, beauty, truth itself, justice, etc. Those are true. And Aristotle realized that it's not the case that ideas are true, it's sentences are true. Things that we say, right? And in fact, there are some things we can say that are neither true nor false. We've talked a little bit about that. Like, hurrah. That's not true or false. How old are you? Well, questions of any sort are neither true nor false. They're questions, right? Imperatives, they're not true or false, right? And we talked a little bit about value statements and the problem we have with those today, and that's because of David Hume, who we talked a little bit about last class, right? And the idea that, a true or false statement has to be a statement that we can all agree on. And we all agree that this is a remote control or something, right? This is a Pepsi, right? Look, it's not even open, so you're pretty sure it's a Pepsi. Probably no E. coli in it, even though it's got a lot of cola, I would imagine, right? But So a true statement is pretty easy for us to all agree on. Once it gets into muddy waters, then we have trouble. That's it, right? Because we have different opinions about things, and when you get right down to it, a scientist isn't basically, of course, a scientist is going to be loaded with opinions, and especially if they want to be a good scientist, well, that's an opinion, what a good scientist is. But a scientist doesn't get into value statements. Those are religion and other things like aesthetics. You don't get a whole lot of religion involved in a beautiful painting. You go to art class for that. What's a beautiful painting, etc. Right? But so we separate science from value. There's lots of morality, you could also call it that, right, etc. And of course, that causes all kinds of concerns in a society that obviously has to have morality, but doesn't necessarily agree on what should be considered moral, etc. Right? But so, going back to Aristotle and trying to understand what his cataclysmic revolution in theory of knowledge is all about, let's point out that sentences or statements are true and false. And they have to be a specific kind of statement, and he called them categorical propositions. And that's in his book, The Categoriae, categories, right? Which is still there. You could, of course, go and read it in English, etc. But what are categories? We could also call them classes. We also call them sets. Lots of different names for them, groups of things, and so on. But so a categorical proposition, which are the kinds of statements that could be true or false, are four types, where you're relating to sets of things. So the one type is all of the members of the subject set are also predicate, the predicate set. And if we use a Venn diagram to draw this, we can say that this circle represents all the members of the subject set, and this circle represents all the members of the predicate set. And if I'm saying that this statement is true, all S is P, then all of the members in this circle that are out here instead of in the other circle as well don't exist. Because I'm saying all of them are in here, right? So we draw this like that to show that this is empty. So I'm drawing in not to show that there are members there. I'm drawing in when there aren't members there. If you take statistics, statistics is just the opposite. And that's designed that way to confuse students so that if you take both courses at once, you will fail both of them.
Why? I almost took statistics this semester.
Because in statistics, that means there are members over here, but in logic, that means no, there aren't. You know, they're all over here, right? So that's all S is P. That's how a Venn diagram represents an A, and this is referred to as an A statement, which is the first letter of the word affirmo. I affirm, right, in Latin. Notice the I in there is some. S is P. So if I'm saying there are some of the members of the subject that are also predicate, I can still do that with the two circles. This is the subject set, this is the predicate set. But I'm not saying that all of the members of S are in here. I'm saying there are at least some. So we draw a little X.
X marks the spot.
X marks the spot. Or at least one or more. There could be more. There could be lots of X's.
Oh.
So some dogs are dachshunds. That would be lots of dogs. Not all of them are dachshunds, but some of them are dachshunds. I'm not saying that some dachshunds are not dogs. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there are some dogs that are dachshunds, right? Then if I say no member of the subject set is in the predicate set, so no S is P. I draw that with a Venn diagram by showing that there are no members in here. This is empty. It's like a whole pit. Right? So all the members of S are over here, and all the members of P over here, and they're mutually excluded from one another. And then the last one, some S is not P. Draw the two circles, and in this case, I draw the X representing some of the members of S over here to show that they're not in P. Now, just because some S is not P doesn't mean that there aren't other S that are P. But if you're affirming that some S is not P, so some dogs are not dachshunds, they're collies. types of thing, right? So these, this is the I statement. You should see how affirmo is over here, and this is nego. And from nego, which means I deny, you take the E for this one and the O for this one. So A and I are the affirm, and E and O are from nego. Paste that. Just put so an E statement and an O statement. Here. So these are the four types of statements that you can have that are true or false. You could have more complex statements that are true or false as well, but those will be compound statements with two or more of these. So your first quiz question for today is to give me a true statement. It should be pretty easy. So just email me a true statement. And tell me which of the four types it is. By the way, it doesn't have to be in this form. You could say something like, the rain is heavier this year than it has been for quite a few years.
Are you looking for a...
That's true, right?
I don't know.
But how do I understand what I'm saying is true when I say something like that? I'm going to have, actually I know it because weathermen are telling me that. Because I'm not out there every day measuring the rainfall, and I'm not keeping records of how much rain Anchorage has been getting, etc. But they've been saying, I'm assuming that they're right. They're the experts, I suppose, right? That we've been getting more rain than usual. But how does that fit into this? I know right off that we're talking about the weather here. So I would say the weather here, right, has to be the subject of my sentence, right? And I'm saying that is heavier, or the weather here is rainier than it has been for years, or whatever I said, right? So the predicate set is the set that says is heavier than it has been for years, right? So the weather today is in the set of things that is heavier, rainier than it has been for years. So that's my predicate, and this is my subject, and it's a statement of this form. I'm not saying some of our weather here is rainier than it's been for years. I'm not saying none of the rain that's here, none of the weather here is heavier, right? And I'm not saying some of our rain is not, although you could, I don't think you could assume that the O statement would also be true, because this is true. If the A statement is true, then the O statement that uses the exact same predicate and subject has to be
False?
related to it, right? False in this case, right? And you could look at these relationships, and now we have what the chapter describes as the square, right, of opposition. It's also referred to as the traditional square, because this goes all the way back to Aristotle, right? We do have an updated version of it, which the chapter talks about, and that's we'll get into that, right? But so if I look at these relationships here, what I notice is that this and this one are both universal. What do they mean by universal? They're talking about all the members of the subject set in both of them. So all of the members of S are also in P. None right? Which means all of them are not, right? But we don't say it that way. We say none are members of set P. So in both of the top ones, we're talking about all the members of the subject set. So they're universal. You can say universal. And by the way, that becomes a technical term throughout our Western cultural history. They refer to these statements as universals. And in fact, if you're talking about sets themselves, where you're talking about in the Middle Ages, when they talk about whether or not the things that are those sets, horseness, does it exist or not, right? What makes horseness, right? They talk about universals, right? Because you're talking about all the characteristics of the set. So these are actually also definitional. When we look at the definitions of things, we're usually talking about the universals that are true for those things. By the way, that's how the categories work. What Aristotle figures is what we need to do in order to know things is literally describe the characteristics of all the things that are out there. Once you describe all the characteristics of the things and relate each category to all the other sets, you know everything. That's what knowledge is, right? It's knowing what all the categories are and all their relationships, right? Because that's everything that's true. And by the way, if you know everything that's true, you also know everything that's false, right? So that's the goal of Aristotle. And by the way, he was very convincing in convincing people that he did know everything in all of his books, so that by the time all of his works were reintroduced into Europe after the Crusades, everyone was absolutely convinced that if you wanted to know something, all you had to do was read it in Aristotle's works. There's no need to go out and investigate and do what we now call science, right? So the scientific revolution was actually a revolution against Aristotle, because for about 200 years everybody thought Aristotle knew everything. And as they started to study things, Galileo, for example, discovering that, Aristotle says that if something is heavy, it falls faster than something that's light, right? And Galileo, of course, famously had this really weird tower in his town, right, which kind of went like this. Still does today, right? The Tower of Pisa. And so he got used to dropping things off the one side, and he discovered that, guess what? If you drop off things that are different weights, heavy and light, they actually arrive on the ground at the same time. In which case, Aristotle was wrong. And this is bad news, right? Because everybody believes everything Aristotle said, and that's just wrong, right? And so we have this scientific revolution against Aristotle, which occurs as a result. But not sure that this part of not everything Aristotle said was wrong. This seems to still be thought of as right, although we'll get into some interesting controversies, right? But so these two are universals because they're talking about all the members of the set. In fact, the problem we'll have is that if we're talking about something that's an empty set, there are no actual existing members. For example, a unicorn. Everyone in this room knows what a unicorn is, I presume? Yes? And in fact, I've seen pictures of them, which that totally screws up everything, right? I'm sure that they're just fake unicorns, right? One of my relatives just recently took, was it a relative or a friend? Facebook friend, who knows? In any case, they took their kids to a place that had a little pony that came from Chincoteague, and the owners put a little, horn on the the pony, and somehow even in the pictures, the tip of the unicorn's horn is like a bright light. So I don't know how that works. But so they've got, you know, their kids all dressed up and riding on a unicorn. It's like, but famously, unicorns actually don't exist. But yet you know what they are. Well, that's a controversy, because how can we know what unicorns are and say that all unicorns have a single horn? And yet there aren't any. And that seems, so is that statement true or false, right? You know, well, that's the definition of a unicorn, so it must be true. And yet if I then say, well, if this statement is true, then the particular statement, particular statement of that statement, all unicorns have a single horn, then some unicorn must have a single horn. And for Aristotle, if this was true, then this had to be true also. The problem is, in English, modern English, and other modern European languages, in order for this to be true, when I'm saying some particular item is in a particular predicate, like some unicorn has a single horn, right? That would have to, that requires us to actually have a unicorn that has that horn for this statement to be true, which makes it an existential fallacy to think that since this is true, this must also be true. And that turns out to be false in modern day. Aristotle didn't have that problem, and we don't really know why. It could be that he just didn't fool around with empty sets, right? Wasn't interested in things that didn't exist. The only things that he was really fascinated with are the things that did exist. And everything that exists, as far as he's concerned, has to have the first category, and that is substance. Had to have physical substance in order for it to have quantity and quality and all the other characteristics that he was basically trying to describe when he was knowing everything about that particular object, right? So particular statements are the I statement and the O statement, because in both of these I'm talking about one or more. At least one or more. So I want to shy away from empty sets. We go to graduate school to deal with empty sets in logic, right? But, so, now what are the relationships? I mentioned that if this one is true, then this one is false. When you're talking about the same subject and predicate. So pick anything. Blondes, for example. All blondes, you've heard this, all blondes have more fun. I've asked this before, and I'm convinced from the blondes that I've talked to, true or not, right? And they all tell me that it's false to say that all blondes have more fun. Because some blondes do not have more fun. There are blondes that are not having more fun. So this is false. This is true, and this is false. Is it true that no blondes have more fun? No, that's false also, because some blondes do have more fun. I don't know how you measure fun or any of that sort of thing. But so those relationships are called contradictions, or contradictories. Works both ways. So if I have all horses are animals, and and I find a horse that's not an animal, that's wrong. Because that screws up the truth of my definition of horses, that they are all animals, right? If I say no cats or dogs, right, no cats or dogs, is there some cat that is a dog? Whoa, that would screw things up too, right? So fortunately, that's not true. It's true that no cats or dogs. They're mutually exclusive, right, sets. See how that works? It's pretty easy. The neat thing about this is when I say one statement that is true, and you automatically, by the way, Aristotle wasn't suggesting that, gosh, study my new technique and you'll be able to know what's true or false. He was not trying to help us understand it. He was describing how it works, assuming we already know true statements and false statements, which I think is true, that everyone already knew what true statements were when you came to the meeting. Oh, now I know what a true statement is. You know, that's not what logic does. But it is amazing that we have this history that goes back with the invention of grammar too, because Aristotle invented grammar and those parts of speech and so on. It's all part of his logic, right? And that when we look at this, what we discover is that when mom says something, and you know it's true, right? You automatically know lots of other relationships because of the relationships that these statements have on the square. So if someone says all horses are animals, you automatically know that it's not the case that you're going to find a horse that is not, that you're not going to find a horse that's, so you negate this. It's not the case that some horse is not an animal. You know that. And I also know that this is false. Because if it's true that all horses are animals, it's got to be false that no horse is an animal. Right? And these are called contraries. They're contrary. They're not contradictory. Because remember, with the case with blondes having more fun, neither this statement nor this statement were true. Both of them were false. Whereas contradictories, if the one statement is true, the other one is false, and and this statement is true, then this one is false. And if this is false, then this is true, and if this is false, then this is true. So contraries are different. Contradictories, one has to be true and one has to be false. Did I say that right? I'm getting old, so I could have easily screwed up. Make sure you check. But contraries, both can be false. So they're not contradictory. So if you're arguing with your daughter and she's being contrary, that's different than being contradictory. So, and it's the case depending on exactly the kind of statement that each of you are making, right? Oddly enough, especially right with blondes having more fun, notice that both of these statements in that case were true. And so these are not contraries, these are sub-contraries. Because both can be true. Sub-contraries are called sub, that means below, because these are the contraries. So sub is just the below ones. This is the standard way of putting up the relationships. You might find a few sites that put the square a little bit differently, but this is the standard. And that also explains some of the names too. And when we look at the relationships here, I said that for Aristotle, if this statement is true, then this statement is true. And the same thing over here. If it's true that no cats are dogs, then it's also going to be true that some cat is not a dog. Right? What other relationship? I think that's all of them. Let me see if I've been going through the book pretty well. Has anybody read through it and seen if I've covered it pretty well? This is really kind of important stuff, because you'll I think find this is a very easy system to get a hold of, but it's got lots of little parts. But as long as you remember all the little parts and you can see how they all put together, it works out really well. So subject, predicate, we've got those. Subject, term, predicate. You could also call them the term, right? An A proposition, an I proposition, an E proposition, an O proposition, standard form categorical proposition. All of these are standard form. So when I said that our weather has been rainier than it has been for years, that statement is not in standard categorical form. And you would have to translate it into standard categorical form in order to see that it's one or the other of these statement types, right? But basically, the meaning of that statement that I'm using to check to see if that statement's true or false comes from the standard form, where I can see the relationships between the two categories that are being related, right? And I know, by the way, that we usually don't think of the predicate always as a set of things. So if I'm walking across the room, that's a statement, an A statement, because I'm all the members of the set that are me, right? And what was my predicate? I'm walking across the room, right? And you might not think of that as a set of things, but all you have to do is kind of a weird head spin on this, and you realize that, well, you're in the set of things that are walking across the room, right?
All people identical to William Jameson are people who are walking across the room.
Exactly. You could get worse if you live in Oxford or Cambridge. Mostly Oxford. Cambridge kind of shied away from a lot of this, but Oxford, they're heavily into it, so much so that they annoy the heck out of even the neighbors, I think, get upset over it. Okay, so let me turn the page here. So universal affirmative is the A statement. A universal negative is the E statement. A particular affirmative is the I statement. And a particular negative is the O statement, right? And that's not really the way I learned it. Remember, I used affirmo and nego, but you can use the word Aristotle in order to memorize the A, I, O, and E. They give you a nice chart here. I don't know who thought that up.
What page is that?
That's page 187. 187. I don't know where that came from. It just popped in there.
Oh.
And when I hear German numbers, I think of young Frankenstein, and when he's explaining to his secretary, his assistant, Inga, I think, the speed of light, right? But I'm not going to turn all this on just to show you him explaining the speed of light. You could look it up. That's 100,000. Sorry, it's Gene Wilder. Yeah, that was kind of funny. Okay, so Quantity, quality, and distribution. What is quantity? Quantity, we use it a lot today. We call it quantum. What is quantum mechanics? Quantum is just Latin for quantity. And quality. We don't have another word for quality besides quality, do we? But what are they? In this case, quantity is how many, of course, and you've got two possibilities, universal or particular. By the way, that covers all of them, because if you're thinking all or some, and this is at least one, maybe many, maybe all, but you don't know. So if you're talking about something, some of the bears in Alaska are brown bears, right? At the moment, it could be all of the bears in Alaska are brown bears. I don't think so. I think there are black bears, there are polar bears, there are teddy bears, koala bears. No, we don't have any koala bears. Panda bears, no panda bears, etc. But you get the idea. I might be talking about all the bears in Alaska. Maybe we've had a plague and all the black bears have been decimated. And grizzlies are actually brown bears as well, right? So maybe even the glacier bears, I think, are brown bears. So if I say some of the bears in Alaska, I might not have the data, but it might turn out that at the time I say that, all of the bears in Alaska are brown. But I didn't know it. And so it still would be true to say some of the bears in Alaska are brown, even if it turns out that all of them. We wouldn't say that you were wrong thinking that it was just some. It's all. Well, I'm just kind of mostly there. I'm not actually wrong, right? Does that make sense? So this actually covers all the possibilities. There are, I should mention, of course, there are some in problems that we have with modern grammar where we have predicates that are relational predicates, where we're talking about a predicate that is more complex than just something that I could say is a set of things, right? So if it's a relational predicate, then I might have problems, and we might wonder if Aristotle was right in saying all statements that are true or false have to fall into these four types of statements. By the way, this is also why it's puzzling when you look at other languages that don't have the verb to be, which is also referred to as the copula, right? Because in each of these statements, notice, I have a copula, which means in languages that don't have the verb to be, strictly speaking, and they know this, right, they cannot use Aristotelian logic. But it puzzles me because if you don't have that, then you cannot have true or false statements. So how can you trust people that don't have the ability in their language to give you a true or false statement? That's wrong. There's got to be something to that, right? How do you handle that? There is a book, I think I mentioned it, that's on how the Chinese language deals with this. And I understand that the argument is that they have a sort of pragmatism about the way their statements work, right? And I haven't read the book, and I don't understand how that might work. It's just one of those baffling things.
What book was that?
I remember reading the abstract or the book review of it because I'm interested in it, and I search for these sorts of weird things. It's relatively recent, but I haven't seen it.
Can you put it in the email? If you
I can look for it.
Any of the book.
Yeah. But I've also listened to lectures. There was years ago here at UAA, we had a visiting professor from Beijing University who gave a lecture to the philosophy department, and lots of people came, and it said, Chinese cannot do this.
Really?
Yeah. So, but that becomes an issue for things like contract law, all sort. You imagine all kinds of problems that would happen. And by the way, we do have difficulties in diplomacy and things with China. Lots of interesting stuff about them. If you're interested, I highly recommend Kissinger's book on China. That's the title, On China, by Henry Kissinger. Do you know who Henry Kissinger is? You're blushing. That's embarrassing, isn't it? The only person in the room that knows who Henry Kissinger is.
I'd like to hear his thoughts on logic. I'm sure he has some
Oh, Henry?
interesting ways of thinking.
Henry? There are a lot of my friends that want to shoot me because I even read Henry Kissinger's books. You know, that's like, ooh.
It's an interesting head to get into.
Oh well.
I'd love to read Freud's book.
And
on logic.
any of you ever hear of Vietnam? 2 people. Oh, okay. So that's called history. I don't know. Okay. Not all history comes from Europe. That's getting distracted even without the internet.
Oh.
So, okay, so in this relationship, these are all terms. What's the name for these? All terms. And this is the super altern, and this is the sub altern. And that's the same over here, altern. Super and sub. I think that's all of the characteristics that come with the square. But we also have to talk about distribution. So quantity is all or some. Quality, so all, some, or none, sorry. And quality is affirmative or negative, right? So the quality is affirmative, A or I, and the other quality is negative, right? And that's E and O. But the important thing here is the mathematics of this, and that is the distribution. And if you look at the little chart, on page 190, notice you have the AEIO statements on the left, and you know that the quantity for the top 2 are universal and the bottom 2 are particular, and the quality, affirmative, negative, and then you see term distributed. Which term is distributed? In an A statement, the subject term is distributed. And the reason for that is when I say something like all horses are animals, you know something about all the members of the subject set. They are animals, right? By the way, notice that the predicate set is not distributed. So even though I know something about all the subject set, I don't know something about all the members of the predicate set. So we say that in an A statement, the subject is distributed, but the predicate is undistributed. So we can put a little d for distributed and a u for undistributed there. Right? Now notice when I have an E statement, when I say no cats or dogs, you know something about all cats, none of them are dogs, and you know something about all dogs, none of them are cats. So both terms are distributed, in an E statement. And in fact, when you give someone an E statement, you're giving them the most information you can possibly give them in one sentence. So that's kind of fun. But then when I give somebody an I statement, since I'm only talking about some of the members of the subject set, my subject set is undistributed. And in fact, notice that the predicate set is undistributed. So in an I statement, I'm giving the absolute least amount of information. Not very helpful. Some bears are friendly. I love how Inspector Clouseau, sees the man standing there with his dog, and he says, "Does your dog bite?" Right. He goes to pet the nice doggy, and the doggy bites. And he looks at, "You said your dog did not bite." He says, "That is not my dog." And I can't figure out how to make that fit the example that I wanted to do, but I still thought, hey, that'll be funny. But this is the weakest premise you can give as an I statement. Right? This is a little bit stronger because in an O statement, the subject set is still undistributed. And this is really odd, but we say that the predicate set is distributed. And you think, well, wait a minute, how? Here's the way I understand this to work. You know that none of the predicate is that one. So you know something about the predicate set in an O statement, that none of them are that one. Seems slippery to me. But as a result, you end up with distribution distributed neatly among all four of them. The subject set is distributed in one. Both are distributed in the E statement. Neither are distributed in the I statement. And the predicate set is distributed in the O statement. And that's the sort of thing you have to keep in mind when you're looking at the next stage, where we look in arguments, which is where we're moving, of course. Okay. The next thing on page 192 talks about existential import. That's just how important is the existence of members of the set in this kind of theory. Well, I mentioned that the problem with unicorns is that unicorns don't actually exist, so there are no members that are in the set of unicorns, right? And when you are in modern European languages, it seems like for a statement to be true that you're talking about as a particular statement about an empty set. It feels odd, it feels like it's not true to say that some unicorn has a single horn, because that makes us feel like you're talking about the one that's out in the yard, but there isn't one out in the yard. And so that's a problem. And so in modern languages, we say that the I statement has to have members of the set. And you can have true statements that are A statements without having members in the set. And so the Aristotelian relationship between the superaltern and the subaltern, the A statement and the I statement. And I suppose that works over here too, but I've never played with that, so I'm not sure. But that means that we have to revise the square. And so the modern square does away with everything except contradictions. And that's what all this explanation is in that area. It's not really that important for us, unless you're going to go into advanced logic later on.
What would one do with advanced logic?
Take even more advanced logic courses, and then you can start teaching logic in universities where you might have 5 students, if you're lucky. Or you can get into computer programming where you become rich.
You need logic to do computer programming?
Computer programming is logic, actually.
Alan Turing.
Alan Turing. Let's not talk about
Yeah.
the British government. However. Okay, so the next one, John Vann, page 198, VENN. And he's famous because he invented circles. Well, I mean, we had circles before, but he invented compiling them in such a way that you can do stuff with them. And so, by the way, when we're reading Aristotle in Greek, Aristotle didn't have circles. In fact, I'm not sure they even used circles in math. I don't remember them actually drawing diagrams and stuff for math in their books. That's confusing to me. There might have been, but those might have been added later. So I'm not sure. If you're interested, if you visit our consortium library, by the way, down on the main campus, and you go up on the 2nd floor, right around the middle, I think the section is PA. If you want to look, the green books. There's like a whole stack of green books that are all Greek, with the English translation on the opposite page. So if you'd like to see what the originals, as far as we know, look like, you could go and look at those. They include the like Euclid's math and Archimedes and things of that sort. So it's interesting trying to figure out what the heck they... And it's even more confusing because remember, the Greeks didn't have numbers. Right? So for Greeks, that's number 1. Right? And how did they draw beta? Anybody remember? Is it like that? It's pretty hard to see because it's running the other game. Delta, gamma. Is that gamma? Gosh, I used to know how to do that. But so that's 1, 2, 3. There's actually another number, I think, that replaced 5, but they don't have it anymore in modern Greek. The modern Greeks, of course, use numbers. It doesn't help them, though. So they still can't add. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm not. Yes, I'm kidding. No, I'm not. That's a couple years worth of fights between them and Germans and etc. Okay, where am I? I got distracted. Oh, so John Vann gave us circles where you can show sets represented with them. By the way, there are stained glass windows in one of the chapels at Cambridge in honor of John Vann, where they have the Vann diagrams in the chapel. You know, the stained glass windows.
Okay.
So that's kind of interesting. Okay. And these are standard for all statements of that type. So they always go this way, so the subject is always on the left and goes to the right until next chapter. We will totally screw you up. Okay.
What is L-tone?
What is
L-tones? L.
alterns?
Yeah, what is that?
Alterns. The alterns are like, so these are the contradictories,
Right.
these are the contraries, these are the subcontraries, and these are alterns. Going from here to here. So this is the superaltern, this is the subaltern. So that's just the relationship between these. So if I were to say the altern of the A statement would be the I statement. The altern of the E statement would be the O statement. Just like the contrary of the A statement would be the E statement.
Right.
And that comes from the word alternate. You also have in your car, you have an alternator, which
Right.
one of my greatest assists to my son was when one night he called me, and he was stuck on the highway. And so I got in the car and I went, he was like parked off the road at Arctic Valley. It just made it to that point. And so I pulled up next to him, and he was sitting there all frustrated because his car broke down. And so as I pulled up, he went to get in the car, and I said, well, let me hear it first. So he sat in the car, and he turned the key, and it did nothing. So I opened the hood, and I said, it's not, the alternator's not even hitting, right? So we unscrewed the alternator cap, and we looked in, and here the rotor had unscrewed and had fallen off. And so he put it back on, screwed it back on, put the cap back on, and the car started right up, and he drove home. And I was like, yes, super dad. You know, da da da. You know how that's Rocky. Da 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 da. I know I don't have any talent. I'm even tripping up here. There's nothing on the floor. Okay, so
I have a
John.
question.
Yes.
So for the homework, if we're giving you a true statement, isn't it always going to be A?
Well, no cats are dogs is true. And it's not an A statement, it's an E statement. A statements are all of the subject is predicate. Now, there are problems like, for example, when I talked about I'm walking across the floor, right, the front of the room or whatever. I am a set of all the things that are identical with myself. Because we could get into, we can make it worse, even more complex, right? But so proper nouns are a set. So if I talk about Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton is the subject set. And even though she's one person, since she's all the members of that subject set, that is an A statement. Right? When I'm saying Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, she was in the set of things that are the Secretary of State. Right? Lots of people have been Secretary of State. Right? Henry Kissinger is Secretary of State. Right? But we don't have more than one Hillary Clinton. Thank goodness. That could have been an interesting, no one. Anybody know who Hillary Clinton is? One person. Oh dear. I voted for her, but that didn't work, as you can see. My wife did not. That was an interesting controversy in our house. But she did not vote for Hillary. I was like, what? She says, I can't trust her. Lying Hillary, you know.
So why does neither of you go with that?
Yeah, we can't. We didn't completely. We were contraries, not contradictories, and that's often the case, actually. But so I can have an example of a true statement for each of these type of statements. One of the books on your desk is the textbook. Right? That's an example of the statement. One of the books, we've got two, right, is your textbook. I'm not saying all of the books on your desk are your textbooks, because that's a notebook. So that's an example of an I statement. And in fact, one of the books on your desk is not a textbook. That's an O statement. In fact, some people feel like if you say, so if, for example, I say, some paperback books are expensive, that almost seems to imply it's also true to say that some paperback books are not expensive. Doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think a lot of people feel like when you're giving an I statement or an O statement, the sub-contrary is also true. But that's not always the case. I just might not know, for sure.
Can you give an example?
Well, some bears in the woods are brown bears. It might be the case that some bears in the woods are not brown bears. I suspect that that's true, because there are black bears, I think. Right? But the trouble with that remember, that's an inductive statement. I would actually have to go out and check, to see which bears are there, right? And scientists don't really do that. They do flyovers. Every once in a while, birders go out and do a bird count, and I think, boy, that's really weird. How can a couple of people in the woods know what birds were here on that day? Because they're only in one particular part of the woods. Same thing with surveys. I've never been called and asked what my opinion is about X. And yet the paper will come out the next day and say, all Americans like X. How did they know? I didn't say I liked X. In fact, I hate X. I prefer Y, actually. Right? So how did they get that information? And then you read the fine print, and it says, we called 5 people. And they all said, and they were all gay people from New York City, and I was like, okay, well, they're nice people, that's fine. But if you're going to ask questions, the Kinsey report famously told Americans that everybody's having sex all the time. So if you're not having sex, you're wrong. And that was like, wow, all these Americans were like, what? I'm not, well, that's bad, And then they discovered that the Kinsey report was based on a study among college students on a particular campus in the spring. It was like, wait a minute, and then you come out and you say that all Americans are like this? Wait a minute, that's crazy. I have a 94-year-old friend that's. Does that make sense? So where do we get this kind of information? We just make it up, a lot of it.
So in order to make these statements, we have to be able to verify that they're true? Is that what I'm hearing you say? Or false? like, I couldn't say, like, some cats are pregnant, and then we could also say, so some cats are not pregnant, but I don't know, like, I haven't personally gone out and seen some pregnant cats, nor seen cats that aren't pregnant, so I can't make either of those statements unless I'm going out and verifying? Is that what I'm?
Well,
am I
one of
hearing
those
that
has
right?
to be true.
I think they're both true.
Yeah, I do. I agree. But even if you haven't gone out and did an investigation, right? The neat thing about that is some cats are pregnant,
Okay,
some cats are not pregnant.
yes,
That covers all possibilities for cats.
okay.
Except for, I mean, male cats would not be pregnant, right? And female cats are not pregnant all the time, right? But
But it still catches that in
a
that
cat
some
is
cats
either
are not
pregnant or it's not.
Right.
And so if you say some pregnants, yeah, some cats are pregnant and some cats are not pregnant,
Because
we would all agree that both are true, even without information other than knowing cats, that there's lots of cats in every continent except Antarctica. Anybody know any cats in Antarctica?
I thought they had some kind of like links thing, but like similar to
In
like,
Antarctica?
I haven't studied Antarctica at all, but I thought I
Yeah,
remembered
I don't
that
think
true.
so. Penguins there,
Yeah, they got the penguin and seals.
Seals, yeah, things.
seals, penguins, gulls, people.
Ice. Lots of ice.
And ice.
Lichen.
Yeah.
Lichen.
Lichen,
down
whether you liken it or not. Yeah. No, so we can have examples of all of these statements as true or false. And in fact, and this is really the funnest part of these, when someone says some cats are pregnant, I automatically know, as we were saying, some pregnant things are cats. Because there are other pregnant things, right? Mice, for example. I think I have mice in my house that are pregnant all the time. You know, so they're like going, there you go, there you go, there you go. Caught 4 just yesterday. It's really bad because that means they're stuck on these little sticky traps and they start going, you know how they do? And I pick the thing up and try to keep my St. Bernard from eating them. Because she's like, oh, let me have it. You know, and I don't want her to eat the, not because the mouse probably wouldn't be good for her, but because she might get stuck to the sticky thing. And that's, you know, then I got to put it in the trash, and then I got to take the stick and smack. Because it's not right to leave it suffering for however. So mice get pregnant. Horses get pregnant. All mammals get pregnant if they're females of the species, right?
And not sterile.
And not sterile. Well, I didn't mean every example individual gets pregnant. Because of course the males don't, by definition.
The oceans don't either.
there were, I think there were 2 male humans that did get pregnant. The one was a guy that had had a operation, right? And the other was Arnold in the movie
Oh, God.
Junior, I think, wasn't it?
Yes.
It's not a tumor, he said, right?
That's kindergarten cop.
Pardon?
That was kindergarten cop.
That was Kindergarten Cop.
Yeah. Yeah.
The quote.
Yeah, the
But
quote.
the movie, it
Well,
was.
the movie
Junior.
was,
Yeah.
It was Junior.
Junior, yeah, I think. Yeah.
I thought he had,
Yeah.
well, so that was just ridiculous. But, so then, knowing that if some cats are pregnant, that there are some pregnant things that are cats, is an example of conversion. And I don't mean like you weren't Catholic before and now you are. That's different, right? But if you take a statement, all of these can be converted. And that means you take them and you flip them around, right? So, for example, if I say all horses are animals, I can flip that around and say all animals are horses. That's the converse of all horses are animals. But notice there's a big difference. It's true that all horses are animals, but if I use the converse and I say all animals are horses, that's false. So notice the converse of an A statement is false. It is not valid, they will say. Right? But if I look at an E statement, and I give you the converse, when I say no cats or dogs, it's also true that no dogs or cats. That's the converse of that statement. No teas are addicting. Is that true? Can you become addicted to tea?
Caffeinated ones, for sure.
You're not addicted to the tea, though. You're addicted to the caffeine.
Caffeine is in the tea.
You're not addicted to the tea. You're
You could be
addicted to the
psychologically
caffeine.
addicted to anything.
Pardon?
You could be psychologically addicted to anything.
I was gonna say, if you're addicted to sex, you're not actually addicted to sex, just the neural firings that are happening in your brain and the hormones and things that would be put into your body by that logic, right? I mean, if you get down to the core of it.
Well, you know, of course, I love Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, argues that just the thought of a sin is committing the sin itself. And that's pretty amazing because today we know that we have mirror neurons. So basically when we're like watching a movie and we're seeing an action, we're imagining what it would feel like to be the people we're watching in the movie, right? And if they're doing something wrong, whoa, we're firing the neural networks that basically make us feel like we're doing what's wrong, right?
Right.
Right? And that's kind of amazing that he said just thinking the thought is as sinful as the sin itself, right? And so that's kind of interesting when you're thinking about lots of human activities, right? And those are important because now we know why children can watch something and learn from the people that they're watching how to do it. And why it's important, for example, to be in the room with someone teaching them to speak. Watching a video of someone teaching them Chinese is not as effective as actually being in a room with someone speaking Chinese. Right? They've done studies on that sort of thing.
I wonder if the same would apply to an Oculus type situation.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
An
I'm sure.
Oculus environment of the classroom.
Right. Yeah. Oh, there's lots of studies actually being done by that. David Chalmers is working on that, so it's kind of
Yeah.
interesting. But so converse statements, all of them can be converted. But remember, if you convert an A statement, it's not equivalent. It's not logically equivalent. And you could look at this picture and you could see why. Because if I flip a Venn diagram of an A statement over, notice that it is very different than the original, right? Because now I would have this area blacked out, right? So it's not the same. But notice when I look at this one, if I flip this diagram around, it'll look exactly the same. Because the converse of an E statement is equivalent to the converse, right? They're equivalent to one another. Notice if I look at an I statement and I flip these, they look exactly the same too. Because the distribution is the same, right? But if I flip these, the converse of this, it's not going to be the same because the x migrates from there over to here. So when you look at conversion,
Some cats are pregnant. Can I have help with that last one? So like, if some cats are not pregnant, how do you flip that?
oh, well, so
Some cats,
you would be saying some pregnant things are not cats. Right?
I just got a brain cramp.
So what you would be saying is some P is not S. See, I literally
Right,
took this,
and flipped it.
flipped it over here. That's, by the way, so I could do that. That's why I decided to do this on the board instead of trying to do it with, I can manipulate, so to speak.
I feel like that would be right. Is that not right? Some pregnant things are not cats. Some pregnant things are horses.
But there's a difference between them being equivalent,
Oh, okay.
right? Yeah, some cats are not pregnant. Some pregnant things are not cats. Both of those are true, but the statements are not equivalent.
Okay.
And what I'm looking at in conversion is equivalence.
Okay.
And so when you have an AEIO statement, you can use conversion for an E statement and an I statement, but not for an A statement and not for an O statement. And we'll see, there's a little chart that gives you all of these. The next one is obversion. And I'll read the little blurb here on page 201. Obversion is an immediate argument formed by changing the quality of the given proposition and then replacing the predicate term with its complement. By the way, the complement is the set of objects that do not belong to a given class. So for example, if I have a set of things here, whatever, set, right? The complement is everything outside of it. It doesn't belong to it, right? And by the way, that's assumed that there's the complements of all of these sets. So, for example, if I draw this box, stuff out here is neither this or that. Neither this nor that. And remember, Aristotle said you do all this automatically in your head. That is provided, of course, you have all the circuits intact. So an obverse statement, let's look at an example of that. All jackhammers, I'm on page 202, all jackhammers are weapons. And now I'm going to use the obverse of that, and that would be no jackhammers are non-weapons.
Is the non-weapon the complement?
Yes. Right, because I know that these are confusing, and the converse of a statement, I think, is pretty easy. You just flip the terms. But the obverse, then you've got to change the quality of the statement. So you go from, like, if it's an A statement, and you change it to an E statement. And then you have to change the predicate to the complement, right? So all jackhammers are weapons, no jackhammers are non-weapons. And of course you could do this with all of them. And the interesting thing about that is that every single one of those will be logically equivalent. By the way, you could skip ahead and look at the chart on page 205. We haven't done contrapositive yet.
So in that case, if you're using an I or an, let's see, that would be an I or an O type situation, would you say some non-S are non-P?
So if I'm using the obverse of this,
Yes.
and I'd say some S is P, my obverse of this stays, right? So some S stays some S is not non-P.
Okay. Okay. I got it.
So I'm putting in a double negative here. So I'm going to, some S is not P. Which is equivalent, because these two race, right? So it's the same. You're saying the same thing. Where this helps is if you want to make people confused, like if you're working for the government and you're giving them directions on how to file something, and you want to say something in a more confused way, right? Instead of saying some S is P, you could say some S is not non-P. And of course, now they're going to be much more confused than they were before. So you're earning your money, you know, because the main job of the bureaucracy is to make sure that no one gets any of the benefits that the legislature passed for them. That's a joke, I hope. But it feels that way sometimes, doesn't it?
All people do agree with that, according to the three people that are.
The three people that I talked to in New York City, in Soho, all agreed with me. In fact, usually when I do a scientific study like that, I talk to all the women that are in the car with me while I'm driving by myself.
There you go.
So I come out of those kinds of sessions and I say 90% of all women feel, and I'm saying, where did you find that out? Well, I called up myself. I happen to know 90%.
This may be slightly off topic. I was reading through this, and in the idea that some can be equal to all, if you were to come home and say, honey, I spent some money at the bar, she looks at the bank account, sees that there's nothing in there anymore, and she gets mad. Could you
She's still
say,
allowed to
honey,
slap you,
honey,
I
you're
think.
being
Oh, well,
illogical?
wait a minute. I don't know if you're allowed to slap someone. I think yeah, you can do that. I don't know if that's good for your relationship, though. Okay, and contrapositives are even more confusing, and that's the last one we do. And that's where, and by the way, they're calling it an immediate argument, but all you're really doing is changing the way you write the statement. It's like, sometimes when you're rewriting an essay and you want to seem more erudite and superfluous or superfluous, right? You look up synonyms or something, that you don't know what the word is, but you can use foot-long words instead of the little word that you want. There was a duck in the pond. You could always go look it up, and you could use the double Latin expression for the whole duck or something. And that makes you seem, ooh, well, that person must have a PhD. By the way, you know the PhD stands for?
Philosophy doctorate, right?
Oh,
Doctorate of philosophy.
well, the way I heard it is if you get a BS degree, that means right? And if you get an MS degree, that's more of the same. And if you get a PhD, it's piled higher and deeper. Never heard that expression? That's just because I'm jealous. Because after I got my master's, I joined the Army instead of going on for a PhD.
Is AS
An associate's in
Right.
science? I've never heard that one in the joke, but okay. So a contrapositive is an immediate argument. That's just a more superfluous way of saying you change the statement around, right? And formed. So you replace the subject term of a given proposition with the complement of its predicate term, and then replacing the predicate term of the given proposition with the complement of its subject term. So if I say something like all pencils are ink-free writing tools, the contrapositive is all non-ink-free writing tools are non-pencils. I don't know who uses this sort of thing. But again, if you're writing income tax directions, how to change a light bulb, those kinds of things, you could use this to make your document much more interesting. But if you look at the pattern on page 205, you could see the conversion works only in two cases. Obversion works in all four statements types, and so they're equivalent. And contrapositives only work in the opposite of the converse. So for conversion, E and I are equivalent. A and O are not. But when you look at the contrapositives, A and O are equivalent, but E and I are not. So that's kind of intriguing. But all of these are examples of intuitive conclusions we can make based on someone giving us one statement. The square of opposition is all of the relationships. Now, it doesn't mean that you know all of them. So typically, of course, if I have an A statement, I know lots more from an A statement. As I said, from an E statement, you know lots more too. But if I give someone a true A statement, they automatically, I believe, intuitively know that the contradiction would be false if what they said was true, right? They would know that the contrary would be false if what they said was true. And they would know that particular examples of that would also have to be true if they were. Because they're saying all of these are this, so a particular example. I could instantiate, give an instance, right? And that would also be true, right? So no matter what statement people give us, we automatically know a whole bunch of things, not just the statement, because statements imply other things, right? Okay.
Is there a verb form for contrary? I was trying to think, why would you contradict me? Because you usually hear contradict, and that's usually when you say something the opposite of what somebody else says.
Yeah, I've never heard of it. But Sarah Palin could invent it,
Absolutely.
and then it would be a real word. So I think that's all I want to do with this chapter. there is an issue, and that is translation. So these forms are the standard form. But and I'm sure you've realized that most people, when they're speaking, don't use these standard forms at all. For one thing, that would be incredibly boring. And I think when I asked you to give me a true statement as your first quiz, right? And you could even look at the relationships on the square from that statement, right? Normally, I get statements that are not in standard form, unless folks think, well, that's what I want, so they'll give me just standard form. But I mean, you could give me, your favorite composer is Brahms. Actually, I don't know of anyone whose favorite composer is Brahms, but you could say something like, my favorite composer is Brahms. If that's true, of course, if that's really your favorite composer. Right. Do you know any Brahms? Brahms' Lullaby? No Brahms. Okay, that was a bad choice. But you get the idea. That would be true. Who would deny it? No, you don't like Brahms. No one would say that, right? You know what you like. Right? My favorite taste is chocolate. No, it's butterbrickle. No one tells you what flavor you should like, etc. So those would be assumed to be true. In fact, normally when you say things to people believe that what you're saying is meant to be true. Normally don't have a reason to lie. Do we? Well, let's not get into that. So normally I think we tell the truth when we're talking to people. We assume that that's the case. Right? You wouldn't go up to someone and say, my eye is sore, and it's false that your eye is sore. You go to a doctor and you complain of a pain. And the doctor might say, have you ever had this before? And you said yes. And he says, well, you've got it again. It hurts me when I do this. Well, don't do that. Those are usually fun. But, okay. I'll quit telling jokes. But we do have to translate our statements into the standard form. And so we have some examples. Non-standard quantifiers, for example. Instead of saying all, none, or rather no, right, and some, we might say something like, not every investment banker is a crook. That's page 224 on the bottom. You see that? Should I have gone back further and applied quantifiers and things of that sort? Singular propositions. Not every investment banker is a crook. What do we mean by that? Are we saying that all investment bankers are crooks? No. Are we saying no investment banker is a crook? No. What we're probably saying is some investment bankers are crooks and some are not. So sometimes when I get a statement that I think is true and I analyze it, what I might discover is that I've really got more than one statement. Because if I make a statement that's complex like that, I'm actually giving both an I statement and a no statement. And the translator, the person thinking, is going to have to realize that, aha, that person meant both of those. And you do that. You do that automatically when people say stuff like that.
I have a weird question. For this, it says, we use lists.
Lists?
All dogs, cats, and horses are animals. Or is it only
Ah,
a
that's excellent.
singular
Excellent example.
subject and singular predicate.
Because if so, what do you think she's doing when she says all cats, dogs, horses?
whatever, are animals.
So how would we figure out if that's true?
Draw a bunch of circles.
We'd have to break it down to all of the statements that you're including in that one compound statement. Because you're saying all cats are animals, all dogs are animals, all horses are animals, right? All robots are animals. Oh, no, wait, that would be wrong, right? Because robots are not animals. So if you included robots in that compound statement, we might look at you and say, oh, that whole statement was false because you included robots, and robots are not animals, right? How did I figure that out? Well, I had to break down your compound statement into all the categorical propositions that you are combining in one thought, right? And we can certainly do that. And we usually do. We don't want to be boring. And so we give a lot of information, usually, right? But when you're trying to figure out, is that true, you're theoretically, Aristotle says, 2,400 years ago, that you're automatically checking all of your sets that were included in that compound statement and figuring out what the individual statement was and putting them all together. And we actually get into more of that when we go on to symbolic logic, where we start talking about the way we combine these statements, because we use conjunction, which is that's an example of conjunction, because you're saying all horses are animals and all cats are animals and all dog, right? You're saying and, but you saved us a lot of space by just deleting all the individual statements and just saying comma, 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 right? How you did it, right? So yeah, when you're translating our thoughts into these categorical statements, keep in mind that these, from Aristotle on, are where the truth occurs. Because we're right at the, and it's kind of interesting as we try to figure out, so how do I know that all horses are animals? Well, of course, I've seen horses, I know the definition of them, etc. But if you get even further and you say, well, no, just because everyone thinks horses are animals, that's how we define them, you've seen them, etc. How do you know that it's true? You can't get any further down than that, psychologically. Right? There's like no there that enables us to know that, aha, so a categorical statement is where we're, that's the bottom of true and false, right? And I mean, it could very well, especially if other languages like, Chinese can't do this, and yet they get along perfectly well, I would think, right? There's way more Chinese, for example, than there are non-Chinese, I believe. Is that right? No. India. That's probably...
No, they're the leading population in the world.
India's pretty darn close, isn't it?
Yeah, they're right around the same.
So,
Are they?
I know, I was watching...
China's a little bit more. They're like at 2.
Well,
They're at one, but I could be wrong.
we only have 300 million
India was at like 1 point
in the
something.
United States, so we're like a drop in the bucket compared to... Amazing. Okay.
Oh yeah, look at articles. Holy crap. 1.38 for China and 1.33 for India.
Yeah, let's make it right.
Okay, so let's take a break. Is this good? We'll take a break. And then we'll go on to chapter 6. which means we'll have caught up with this.